It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us to talk about Calm in Chaos, his book, Catholic Wisdom for Anxious Times, is Father George Rutler. Thank you for being here, Father Rutler.
I'm glad to be able to chat.
Would you consider yourself to be an anxious person?
Anxious?
Yeah.
No, but a lot of people around me are anxious.
Why do you think? Anxious because of you?
I think probably, maybe. The book I call Calm in Chaos. I say in the beginning that the surest way to get people upset is to say, calm down, because I think that's the surest way to don't panic, they'll panic.
Right.
In the Second World War, in England they had those posters, keep calm and carry on. And actually, they didn't need very many because the people just they went to work and patriotically, and to the surprise of the government, you had the greatest generation making great sacrifices. But that was one of the great crises of history. And the point of my book is that we are in a great crisis, and a crisis is a test. I mean, when the fever reaches a crisis, you either live or die, and it depends on the reaction of the people.
So, as far as crises go, how would you rank our current crises? Is this an abnormal situation, a time of trouble, a time of anxiety, or have we seen this, pretty frequently in history?
Well, you mentioned history. A point I really drive in this book, which is a collection of essays, they're on very, very different subjects, but each one demonstrates how we react to crisis. We don't know our history very well. History isn't really taught in our schools properly, and therefore people don't have the resources of past knowledge to know how to deal with present situations. Everybody's had to go through crisis in history, and we can learn a lot from how the great people have responded, and also learn negatively from how the evil people have responded, and how most of the people in between responded. But there is a theory, and I think it holds water, that about every 500 years there's some major test in civilization, certainly in the church. The church is the heart of civilization. You have to remember that. And what affects the church affects the whole civilized order. At the end of the first 500 years, you had the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. At the end of the next 500 years, you had the split between the East and Western churches, the Latin and Byzantine churches. 500 years later, you had the Protestant revolt. But I think we have all, sort of in a way now, all those concerns coming together. We have the political fact, just as we did in the Roman Empire. I mean, our politics today is in crisis. And just as you had that division in the church, so we have now the same situation too. Church is being torn by people of different understandings of what the church is. And then just as you had in the Protestant revolt, a theological question, or serious theological question, so people are now asking about the doctrines of the church. And then you add to that moral corruption, and you get a very, very volatile picture. And the other thing to remember, though, is that there's a difference between optimism and hope. Optimism is wishing that things will go well, and that's just a wish. They may or may not. But hope is a gift from God. It's one of the theological virtues. We call it that because it comes from God, theos. Hope is not wishful thinking. It's the confidence that if we do God's will, things will work out. We don't know how they will work out or how long it will take for them to work out. But our Lord says, be of good cheer, I have overcome the world. So it's a question, are we going to focus on Christ or on ourselves? When our Lord was walking on water, he called to Peter to come out of the boat, and Peter did, even though he couldn't believe what he was doing, because he knew the laws of hydraulics. He was a fisherman. Right. But as long as he looked at our Lord, he was able to do it. But when he focused on himself, then he began to sink. So I think the way to handle a crisis such as we're in now is to look at Christ and not to focus on ourselves. We're a generation, or a couple we've inherited from the last generation or two, narcissism, a reflection, a focus on the self. It's our me generation, and I think that's at the heart of the crisis we're going through. And people have been sold a bag of goods. They were told that they can get on in life doing their own thing, and they don't need God. Well, that goes back to the fall of man, our first ancestors. You shall be as gods, and that's taught in our schools and our entertainment. And so what happens is, all right, you can live in a bubble, a fantasy, when you're in school, but eventually, when you go out into the real world, you find that you are dealing with reality. We've had experience like in the last couple of years, and young people, the presidential election and other events, they were told wrong things, and then things didn't go the way they were told they were going to go. So what happens? They run into safe spaces, need therapy. Well, our Lord didn't send the apostles out into safe spaces. He told them what they were going to get into. And you go down the whole list. This is why it's so important to know history. Joan of Arc saved France when she was about the age of a high school senior. Don Juan of Austria led the papal fleets at the Battle of Lepanto and saved Western civilization when he was 24 years old. Alexander Hamilton was a lieutenant general in the American Revolution at 21. And the average age of a bomber pilot in the Second World War was about the age of a college sophomore. They didn't have safe spaces. They couldn't afford that luxury. And so I think what's going on now is a real cleansing. And in the long run, although it's painful right now, it's like pulling a tooth, it ends up well. But you have to recognize that this is a cleansing going on. And if we hadn't had all these exposures of corruption in every way, in church and in our society as a whole, that infection would have gotten worse.
We're talking with Father George Rutler. His book is Calm in Chaos, Catholic Wisdom for Anxious Times. You're talking about all of the chaos that's going on, and the idea of the book is to find calm in this, and you talked about that being an issue of focusing on hope. And so I think whenever we hear that, it sounds great, and to be able to tell somebody to walk on water sounds great, but how do we actually put that into practice? Is it like mind over matter, kind of fake it until you make it, just believe that everything's going to work out?
No, that's superstition. That's wishful thinking. What we need is grace. Grace is the power of God. Our Lord says, my grace is sufficient. Our Lord never leads us into a situation without giving us the strength to deal with that. Mm-hmm. But we have to understand the power of grace. Now, St. John says our Lord is the logic of the universe. He's the logos, the word. And if we move away from Christ, we become illogical. And that's why I think now we have in our society so much anger. Instead of having rational debates, I mean, people are entitled to their different opinions. Mm-hmm. And that civilized people will discuss things and they'll debate things, but they won't try to beat the opponent over there with a baseball bat. And what's happening now, look at in our schools when visiting lecturers lecture on a subject that's politically incorrect, contrary to what kids have been taught, they try to shout them down, mm-hmm. or they try to riot. In our government now, the same thing. I mean, we have this current debate about Supreme Court appointments. Instead of rationally, logically discussing the merits of a candidate, you have people running around on the balconies of the Senate screaming. That's a sign of desperation and of surrender, really, to the chaos of the devil. The devil is the source of chaos. The first thing our Lord said when he rose from the dead was peace, shalom. It's the devil who causes chaos, and the devil cannot argue logically.
So then what does a Christian disposition of calm look like?
Well, I think two marks. One is serenity. Okay. That is keeping your head on straight, not panicking. And two, having a sense of healthy humor. Humor is a perception of imbalance. We laugh at things that are off kilter. It's only when you're crazy that you laugh at what isn't funny. And you can always measure the fanatic because he has no sense of humor. It doesn't matter what he's fanatical about, in religion or politics. They can have very different views, but once you get off the subject, it's the same kind of personality. They have no sense of humor. And the highest form of humor is self-humor, being able to laugh at ourselves and not taking ourselves too seriously, but taking God seriously. The great writer Chesterton said that angels can fly because they don't take themselves seriously.
You wrote this, and it came out in July of 2018. It seems like things have even gotten more chaotic since the book was released. Were you a prophet? Did you know this was going to happen?
No. Okay. A prophet, technically, a prophet isn't somebody who tells the future. A prophet is somebody who conveys the truth of God. And when we do that, then we can pretty much decide what's going to happen if you obey God or disobey God. But some of these essays there, I'll go back maybe 20 years. But human nature doesn't change, and so you can easily predict what will happen when people try to live a lie. I did sense what was going to happen, not how it was going to happen, but chaos in the church, chaos in politics. I did sense that we were really on the wrong track, but philosophers were dated back centuries ago when people began to question objective reason. Then the deification of reason in the 18th century, the reign of terror, French Revolution, and then the worship of power, the Nazis, the replacement of God's plan for history with economic conflict, that was Marxism. All of these mistakes took a toll on society, and this is why it's very important, as I said before, to know the past. The old saying is, if you don't know the past, you're going to repeat it. We have to learn why were these mistakes mistakes? Now, we have people today who are saying that they weren't mistakes. It's easy to fool other people who do not know the truth. But the greatest leaders, the greatest models in any kind of crisis are the saints. And there are tons of saints we don't even know are saints. But I worked with Mother Teresa off and on for about 9 years. You could see she suffered very much, and she saw terrible suffering around her, but she never panicked. She was a kind of island of calm, and she had a very quiet sense of humor. And that's why when the church wants to officially declare someone a saint, they require evidence of joy. Now, joy is more than happiness. Just as there's a difference between optimism and hope, optimism is a wish, hope is a fact. There's a difference between happiness, which is a feeling, and joy, which is a fact. And the fact is that you're happy with God. Well, our society is very good at making people feel temporarily happy. We live in an opioid culture, drugs and sex, liberation, so forth, which turns out to be a vice, an imprisonment. In my parish here, I'm in Midtown Manhattan, and I'm not exaggerating when I say within my parish bounds there are maybe about 300 bars and saloons. And they advertise happy hours. Well, all right. If you take that in moderation, it's fine. But note, it's only a happy hour. It's not a happy eternity. But joy is forever. That's what our Lord says, I've come that you might have joy, and that your joy might be full. But we have to know what we're feeling. And that means knowing what it means to be. What is the human person? What is the soul? What is the intellect? And what is the will? And these are facts that have been ignored in the last couple generations, and we're paying a price for it now.
Well, I can't think of a more appropriate time for this book to come out. I know this is going to benefit a lot of people. So where can people get a copy of it?
The publisher is Ignatius Press, San Francisco, but it's also on Amazon and the other online bookshops.
All right, again, it's called Calm in Chaos, Catholic Wisdom for Anxious Times. Thank you so much, Father George Rutler, for joining us today and sharing it with us. Appreciate it.
Well, it's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure talking. God bless. Bye.